thrown out into the freezing night with her 2 children and only $63.42 in her pocket, 31-year-old Sarah Mercer had nowhere left to go. Her 4-year-old son was burning with fever. Her 6-year-old daughter was crying because one of her shoes had disappeared somewhere in the snow, and behind them, the only house Sarah had called home for 9 years was already being locked for good. Her husband, Daniel, had given her 10 minutes to leave. Then he had delivered one final warning. "Don't even think about going to that farmhouse," he said through the doorway. "It's worthless." Sarah stared at him. "You're throwing your own children outside." Daniel's expression barely changed. "I told you, the house isn't yours anymore." Behind him stood his sister, Melissa, holding a folder Sarah recognized immediately, her father's probate documents. The inheritance had been worth $186,400. But Daniel had spent months telling Sarah there was almost nothing left, a few unpaid bills, some worthless land, and one abandoned farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania that nobody wanted. Sarah had believed him. Until tonight. She pulled her daughter's coat tighter around her shoulders. "Daniel, please. It's below freezing." He looked toward the children, then away. "You have somewhere to go." "No, I don't." The door closed. The lock clicked. Sarah stood motionless on the porch as warm yellow light spilled through the windows behind her. Inside was the Christmas tree she had decorated. Inside were the children's beds. Inside was the kitchen where she had cooked thousands of meals. And now she was standing outside with 2 crying children and everything she owned stuffed into 3 bags. She picked up her sleeping son. "Come on," she whispered. Her daughter wiped her face with her sleeve. "Mommy, where are we going?" Sarah looked down at the folded inheritance papers. In her pocket, there was only one place left. The farmhouse. Daniel had called it worthless. He had warned her never to go there. But Sarah had never understood why. 11 miles beyond the last gas station, the abandoned property sat on 41 acres of frozen land, far from the nearest town. No working furnace, no electricity, no running water, and no one living nearby. It wasn't a home. Not anymore. But as Sarah walked into the falling snow with her children, she had no idea that the farmhouse was hiding something Daniel's family had spent decades trying to keep buried. And she certainly didn't know that the inheritance her husband had called worthless was worth far more than the $186,400 written on those old probate papers. For tonight, though, Sarah had only one goal: get her children somewhere warm before the snow became the least of their problems. 6 months earlier, Sarah had still believed her family was struggling together. It had been difficult, but manageable. Daniel worked as a contractor in Harrisburg, and Sarah worked part-time at a grocery store while taking care of the children. They weren't wealthy. Some months, she had to choose between replacing a broken appliance and paying an overdue bill. But they had a home. That had always been enough. Then Sarah's father died. His name was Thomas Mercer, and he had spent most of his life avoiding the subject of money. At the funeral, Daniel had quietly taken control of everything. "I'll handle the probate paperwork," he told Sarah. "You shouldn't have to deal with this right now." She was grieving. She trusted him. Daniel took that trust and turned it into a weapon. Over the next few weeks, he began bringing documents home and asking Sarah to sign them. "This one is for the estate. This one is for the bank. This just transfers the property so we don't have problems later." Sarah signed. She never imagined those signatures would eventually be used against her. Then the bills started arriving. The mortgage was behind. The electric company had sent a final notice. Daniel's business account had been overdrawn by thousands of dollars. Whenever Sarah asked what was happening, he became irritated. "I've got it under control." But he didn't. By October, Daniel had borrowed $38,000 against the house. Sarah discovered it by accident. She found the paperwork beneath a stack of old receipts while looking for her daughter's birth certificate. That night, she confronted him. You borrowed money against our house? Daniel stared at her for several seconds. Then he said something that frightened her more than the debt. You don't understand what the house is worth. Sarah remembered that sentence, because 3 weeks later, Daniel told H. the inheritance was nearly worthless. And then he started asking questions about the farmhouse. Had her father ever mentioned it? Did Sarah know where the original deed was? Had she ever visited the property? Sarah hadn't. She had barely known it existed. The strange questions continued until one afternoon, Daniel came home unusually quiet. He placed a folder on the kitchen table. You need to sign these. Sarah looked at the papers. What are they? Nothing complicated. She didn't touch them. Daniel, what is happening? His face hardened. The house is going to be mine. Sarah stared at him. What? I've already taken care of most of it. Her stomach tightened. You can't just take my house. Daniel leaned closer. You signed the documents. Sarah's eyes moved across the pages. Her signature was there, again and again. She suddenly understood why he had always insisted on handling the paperwork. The argument lasted nearly an hour. Sarah cried. Daniel shouted. Their daughter heard them from upstairs. Then came the sentence Sarah would never forget. If you don't cooperate, you'll have nowhere to live. 2 weeks later, Daniel left. Not with an explanation. Not with an apology. He simply emptied the joint account, changed the locks, and stopped answering her calls. Sarah spent the next several days trying to find somewhere to stay. Her mother was dead. Her father's estate was tied up in probate. Her closest friend had no spare room. And every motel Sarah could afford wanted money she didn't have. Then, while searching through her father's papers one last time, she found the old property document. The farmhouse, 41 acres, a parcel of woodland, a detached barn, and one handwritten sentence in the margin. Go there if necessary. Sarah stared at those 4 words for a long time. Why had her father written them? Why had Daniel been so interested in the property, and why had he warned her never to go? She didn't have the answers. But she had 2 children who needed a roof. So when Daniel finally put her outside in the snow, Sarah stopped thinking about what she had lost. She started thinking about the farmhouse. It was the only thing left that belonged to her. At least, that's what she believed. And before the night was over, she would discover that her father had left her far more than a piece of abandoned land. By the time Sarah reached the farmhouse, the snow had nearly covered the road behind her. She had carried her son for the last 2 miles. Her arms were aching, her coat was soaked at the shoulders, and every few minutes she had to stop to make sure the little boy was still breathing comfortably. Her daughter walked beside her, dragging the small suitcase through the snow. "Mommy, is that it?" Sarah looked up. Beyond the rusted iron gate stood the farmhouse. For a moment, she simply stared. It was larger than she had imagined, but years of neglect had stripped away whatever beauty it once possessed. The roof sagged over one side of the house. Several windows were broken. The white paint had peeled away until most of the wood underneath was exposed. A dead apple tree leaned against the side of the barn. The whole property looked abandoned. Not recently abandoned. Forgotten. Sarah pushed open the gate. It gave a long, metallic groan that disappeared into the wind. Her daughter moved closer. "Does anyone live here?" "No." Sarah looked at the dark windows. "At least, I don't think so." The front door was unlocked. That surprised her. She pushed it open. Cold air rushed through the hallway. Inside, everything smelled of dust, old wood, and damp plaster. Sarah carried her son into the living room and lowered him onto a faded sofa. Her daughter stood in the doorway looking around. "It's scary." "I know." Sarah forced a small smile. "But we're going to make it warm." She had no idea how. There was no electricity. The pipes had frozen. The furnace didn't work. But after searching through several rooms, Sarah found an old wood-burning stove in the kitchen. Beside it was a small pile of dry firewood. Enough for one night. Maybe two. She found matches in a drawer and spent nearly 20 minutes getting the stove to burn. When the first flames appeared, her daughter smiled. Sarah almost cried. She hadn't realized how badly she needed to see that smile. She found blankets upstairs, along with an old mattress that wasn't completely ruined. Her son was still feverish, but once she wrapped him in the blankets and placed him near the stove, his breathing became calmer. Sarah finally sat down at the kitchen table. She opened the old property papers again. Her father's handwriting appeared in the margin. "Go there, if necessary." She traced the words with her finger. "Why, Dad?" There was no answer. Only the sound of the wind outside. Sarah looked around the kitchen. There was an old refrigerator, a wooden pantry, several cabinets, a large farmhouse table. Everything appeared ordinary. Then she noticed something hanging on the wall. A photograph. Sarah stood and walked toward it. It showed a family standing outside the farmhouse decades earlier. There were 12 people in the picture. At the center stood an older man Sarah recognized immediately. Her grandfather. She had seen his face in old family albums. But there was something else. Near the edge of the photograph stood a young woman. Sarah moved closer. The woman was wearing a small silver pendant. Sarah's breath caught. Her mother had owned the same pendant. She remembered it clearly. Her mother had worn it every Christmas until the year Sarah turned 12. Sarah reached toward the photograph, then stopped. Why would her mother be standing in a photograph taken at a farmhouse Sarah had never known existed? She studied the picture again. Someone had scratched a line across the woman's face. Not accidentally, deliberately. Sarah lowered her hand. Suddenly, the farmhouse didn't feel quite so empty. She returned to the table and opened another folder. Inside were tax records, old receipts, and property documents. Most were decades old. But one document made her stop. It listed the farmhouse as part of a much larger property. The original estate had once covered more than 200 acres. Sarah frowned. Her father had never mentioned that. She turned the page. Someone had crossed out the original acreage in blue ink, then rewritten it. 41 acres. Sarah stared at the alteration. Who had reduced the property, and why? A floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around. Nothing. Only the hallway. Sarah waited. Silence. Then she heard it again, a faint sound beneath her feet. She slowly looked down. The kitchen floor was made of old wooden boards. One section near the pantry looked slightly darker than the rest. Sarah stepped toward it. The board shifted. She froze. She pressed her shoe down again. A faint, hollow sound came from underneath. Sarah crouched. Her fingers brushed away the dust. There, carved into the wood, was a small symbol, a circle with a line through the center. Sarah had seen it before. It was engraved on her mother's silver pendant. Her heart began beating faster. She touched the marking. Then 3 slow knocks sounded from the front door. Sarah stood immediately. Someone was outside. She hadn't told anyone she was coming here, and according to the property records, there wasn't supposed to be a neighbor for nearly 2 miles. Another knock came. Harder this time. Sarah looked toward the staircase. Her children were upstairs. She grabbed the fireplace poker and moved quietly toward the hallway. A man's voice came through the door. Mrs. Mercer. Sarah stopped. The man knew her name. You shouldn't be staying here, he said. Sarah tightened her grip on the poker. Then the man added something that made her blood run cold. Your father made the same mistake. Sarah didn't open the door. She stood several feet away, gripping the fireplace poker with both hands. Who are you? There was a pause. Then the man answered. My name is Walter Hayes. Sarah didn't recognize the name. What do you want? I came to make sure you understood something. What? You shouldn't be here. Sarah glanced toward the staircase. Her children were still upstairs. She lowered her voice. This is my property. Another pause. That's what your father thought. Sarah's stomach tightened. What does that mean? But there was no answer. By the time she reached the door and looked through the glass, the man was already walking back toward the road. He was tall, perhaps 60 years old, wearing a dark winter coat and carrying an old leather briefcase. Sarah opened the door just enough to call after him. Mr. Hayes! He stopped. Why did you say my father made the same mistake? Walter turned around. For several seconds he simply looked at her. Then he said, Because Thomas Mercer believed the truth would protect him. Sarah waited. Walter's expression hardened. It didn't. Then he walked away. Sarah closed the door. She locked it. Then she locked it again. For the next hour, she couldn't stop thinking about the man's words. Her father had believed the truth would protect him. From whom? And what truth? Sarah returned to the kitchen. The children were asleep upstairs now. The fire had burned low. She added another piece of wood and looked down at the strange symbol carved into the floor. She took a kitchen knife and carefully worked the blade beneath the edge of the board. It lifted slightly, not enough to open, but enough to reveal something beneath it. A thin brass object. Sarah pulled it free. It was a key. Small, old, covered in black tarnish. She held it up beside the oil lamp. There was a T, any number stamped into the metal, 17. Sarah turned it over. On the other side was the same circular symbol, her mother's symbol. She sat down. For several minutes she simply held the key. Then she remembered something. Her father had kept an old metal toolbox in his garage. Inside it had been dozens of keys. One key had always been missing. Sarah had asked him about it when she was a teenager. He had laughed and said, "Some doors are better left closed." At the time, she thought he was joking. Now she wasn't so sure. Sarah searched the kitchen. She checked the pantry, the cabinets, the walls. Nothing. Then she noticed the old wooden table. There were 17 shallow scratches carved underneath its edge. She counted them twice. 17. Sarah's pulse quickened. She turned the table around. Behind it, partially hidden by years of dust, was a small metal lock. The key fit. Sarah hesitated. Her father's warning came back to her. Some doors are better left closed. She looked toward the stairs. Her children were asleep. She had spent the entire night running from one disaster to another. Maybe she should leave the farmhouse in the morning. Maybe this place was dangerous. But Daniel had known about it. Walter had known about it. Her father had left instructions. And now someone had hidden a key beneath the floor. Sarah inserted the key. It turned. Something clicked inside the wall. Sarah stepped backward. A narrow wooden panel beside the pantry shifted outward by less than an inch. She stared at it. The farmhouse wasn't empty. It had been hiding something. and someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure Sarah never found it. The panel moved another inch. Sarah stood perfectly still. She could see darkness behind it. Not an empty wall. A narrow space. She reached for the oil lamp and held it closer. There was a small staircase leading downward. Only 6 steps. At the bottom was a wooden door. Sarah's first instinct was to turn around. Instead, she remembered Daniel's face when he had told her the farmhouse was worthless. She remembered how quickly he had asked whether she knew where the original deed was. She remembered Walter Hayes standing outside in the snow. And suddenly, Sarah understood something. People didn't threaten someone over worthless property. She stepped onto the first stair. The wood creaked beneath her. Before she could take another step, she heard a noise upstairs. Her son was crying. Sarah immediately climbed back up. By the time she reached the bedroom, her son was sitting upright, frightened and sweating. "Mommy?" "I'm here." She touched his forehead, still warm. She held him against her chest until his breathing settled. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat beside the children until dawn. The next morning, someone came to the farmhouse again. This time it wasn't Walter. It was Daniel. Sarah saw his truck coming through the gate. For several seconds, she couldn't believe it. Then he stepped out. He wasn't alone. Melissa was with him. Sarah went outside and closed the door behind her. "What are you doing here?" Daniel looked past her toward the farmhouse. "You actually came." Sarah felt something cold move through her stomach. "You knew I'd come here." "I suspected." "Why?" Daniel ignored the question. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a white envelope. "I want to make this easy." Sarah didn't take it. "What is it?" "An offer." She laughed bitterly. "You threw me out last night." "I know. You left my children in the snow." "Sarah, no." She stepped closer. "You don't get to come here and pretend we're discussing a business deal." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'll give you $18,500 home." Sarah stared at him. "For what?" "The farmhouse. You said it was worthless." "It is." "Then why are you offering me $18,500? Daniel didn't answer. Melissa stepped forward. "You're not in a position to be difficult, Sarah." Sarah looked at her. "I don't think I'm the one being difficult." Daniel opened the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check, $18,500. Sarah looked at the number. For someone with 63 or 42 pounds left, it was a lot of money. It could pay for an apartment, food, heating, her son's medical bills, a fresh start. Daniel saw her hesitation. "Take it." Sarah looked up. "Why do you need this place so badly?" "Because I have a buyer." "Who?" "A development company." "What are they planning to do?" Daniel's expression changed. "That's not your concern." Sarah folded her arms. "Then neither is selling it." Daniel stepped closer. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand that you're offering me $18,500 for a property you called worthless." His voice dropped. "Sign the deed." Sarah shook her head. "No." Daniel's face hardened. "You'll regret this." Sarah looked directly at him. "Maybe." She pointed toward the road. "But I'm not selling." For the first time, Daniel looked genuinely frightened. Not angry. Frightened. His eyes moved toward the farmhouse, toward the kitchen, toward the very floor where Sarah had found the hidden key. Then he looked back at her. "Sarah, listen to me." She said nothing. "You need to leave this property." "Why?" Daniel swallowed. "Because you don't know what you're dealing with." Sarah stared at him. Then she asked the question that made him go completely silent. "What are you afraid I'll find?" Daniel's face went pale. Melissa grabbed his arm. "Daniel." He pulled away. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Daniel got into his truck. Before he drove away, he lowered the window. "This is your last chance." Sarah stood on the porch. "Your offer?" No. Daniel looked at the farmhouse. My warning. The truck disappeared through the gate. Sarah remained outside until it was gone. Then she returned to the kitchen. She walked straight to the hidden panel. The staircase was still there, and this time Sarah wasn't afraid of what she might find. She was afraid of what Daniel already knew. Sarah waited until Daniel's truck disappeared before closing the front door. She locked it. Then she stood in the hallway, listening to the silence. Her children were upstairs. The farmhouse was cold again, but something had changed. Sarah no longer believed Daniel had come to help her. He had come because he was afraid. She returned to the kitchen and stared at the hidden panel. Before she could open it, she heard her daughter scream, "Mommy!" Sarah ran upstairs. Her daughter was standing beside the bedroom window, pointing outside. There was someone there. Sarah looked through the glass. At first, she saw nothing except snow-covered trees. Then she noticed footprints, fresh footprints. They started near the barn and ended beneath the window. Sarah's stomach tightened. She pulled the children away from the glass. "Stay here." She grabbed the fireplace poker and went downstairs. The back door was still locked. The kitchen window was closed, but when she checked the pantry, she found the old cellar door standing open. Sarah knew she had closed it earlier. She approached slowly. The smell of damp earth rose from below. Someone had been inside. She didn't go down. Instead, she returned upstairs and stayed with the children until morning. At sunrise, Sarah found something else. Her father's property papers were gone. She had left them on the kitchen table. Now the folder was empty. Sarah searched every room. Nothing. Then she noticed the kitchen floor. The hidden panel was open. Someone had gone inside the passage. Sarah's hands began to shake. She remembered Daniel's warning. Then she remembered Walter Hayes. She needed answers. That afternoon, Sarah drove into town using an old pickup she found behind the barn. It started after several attempts. She stopped at a small diner and asked the waitress about Walter Hayes. The bowl. Omen's expression changed immediately. You know Walter? He came to my farmhouse. The waitress lowered her voice. Then you should talk to him carefully. Why? He used to work for your father. Sarah froze. What did he do? The woman looked toward the kitchen. Your father trusted him. Then she leaned closer. But after Thomas died, Walter stopped talking to everyone. Sarah returned to the farmhouse before dark. Walter was waiting outside. He looked at her hands. You found the key. Sarah said nothing. Walter sighed. I was hoping you wouldn't. Then tell me the truth. He looked toward the farmhouse. Your father knew someone was stealing from the estate. Who? Walter shook his head. Not here. Why? Because somebody has been watching this place. Sarah stared at him. Daniel? Walter didn't answer. He simply reached into his coat and handed her a folded piece of paper. Sarah opened it. It was a copy of an old property map. One section had been circled in red. Underneath it were 3 words. Kitchen. 17. Basement. Sarah looked up. Walter was already walking away. Wait! He stopped. What does 17 mean? Walter turned. The number your father used when he wanted you to know he was telling the truth. Then he walked into the falling snow. Sarah looked down at the map. For the first time, she understood that the hidden door beneath the kitchen floor wasn't the mystery. It was only the beginning. Sarah waited until both children were asleep before returning to the kitchen. She placed Walter's map on the table. The red circle was unmistakable. Kitchen, 17. Basement. She looked at the hidden panel, then at the floor. The number 17 had appeared too many times to be coincidence. Sarah pulled the panel open and descended the narrow staircase. At the bottom was a small wooden door. There was no handle, only a brass keyhole. Sarah took the key she had found beneath the floorboard. It fit perfectly. The lock clicked. The door opened inward. A narrow room stretched beneath the farmhouse. Sarah raised the lantern. Shelves covered both walls. Old boxes sat beneath them. Property records, photographs, ledgers, bank envelopes, and dozens of documents tied together with faded string. For several seconds, Sarah couldn't move. This wasn't a cellar. It was an archive. She picked up the first ledger. The cover was marked, Mercer Estate, 1987 to 2004. Sarah opened it. The pages contained payments, land transfers, business transactions, and names she recognized from her father's old stories. Then she saw something that made her stop. A payment for $75,000. Beside it was a name. Daniel's father. Sarah read the entry twice. Her husband had always claimed his family had never been involved with her father's property. The ledger suggested otherwise. She turned another page. There were more payments, $42,000, $118,000, £63,500, all transferred from companies Sarah had never heard of. Then she found a folded property map. The farmhouse was marked in black, but the map showed something else. The original Mercer estate had once covered more than 1,200 acres. Most of it had been transferred away over a period of 17 years, and every transfer had been approved by the same attorney. Sarah recognized the name, Hardcoal, Daniel's uncle. Her breathing became shallow. She searched through the boxes faster. Photographs, contracts, tax records. Then she found an envelope marked with her father's handwriting. For Sarah. Only if they come looking. Her fingers trembled. She opened it. Inside was a photograph of her father standing beside a much younger Walter Hayes. Behind them was the farmhouse. On the back, Thomas had written a single sentence. They thought I didn't keep copies. Sarah sat down on the cold floor. There was something else inside the envelope. A small brass tag. Number 17. She turned it over. Engraved on the back was the same circular symbol, the one from her mother's pendant. Sarah suddenly remembered her father's old phrase. Some doors are better left closed. He hadn't been talking about a literal door. He had been talking about evidence. Evidence that someone had spent decades trying to erase. A floorboard creaked above her. Sarah froze. She extinguished the lantern. Footsteps moved across the kitchen. Slowly. Someone was inside the farmhouse. Sarah held her breath. The footsteps stopped directly above the hidden room. Then she heard the kitchen floorboard scrape. Someone had found the panel. Sarah looked at the documents scattered around her. There was no other exit. The footsteps began descending the stairs. One step, then another. Sarah gripped the brass tag in her hand. Whoever had entered the farmhouse wasn't searching for the property. They were searching for the evidence, and they were already inside. The footsteps stopped halfway down the stairs. Sarah could hear someone breathing above her. She pressed herself against the wall and held the documents tightly against her chest. Then the footsteps moved back upstairs. A door slammed. Sarah waited. 30 seconds, then a full minute. Nothing. She carefully relit the lantern. The hidden room was exactly as she had left it, except for one thing. The envelope marked For Sarah, only if they come looking was gone. Her heart dropped. She searched the floor. Nothing. Then she noticed a loose stone behind the lowest shelf. Sarah pulled it free. Behind it was a narrow compartment. Inside was another envelope. This one had her full name written across the front in her father's handwriting. Sarah Elizabeth Mercer. Her hands began to tremble. She opened it. The first line made her stop breathing. Sarah, if you are reading this, then the people I spent my life trying to keep away from you have finally found you. She sat down. The letter continued. I wanted to tell you everything while I was alive. Your mother begged me not to. She believed the truth would put you in danger. Sarah covered her mouth. Her mother had known. The farmhouse was never worthless. It was the last piece of the original Mercer estate that I refused to surrender. Sarah looked toward the ceiling. Your grandfather owned more than 1,200 acres. The land was gradually taken from him through forged transfers, false debts, and agreements he never approved. Sarah read faster. Your Uncle Richard helped arrange many of those transfers. Her hands shook. But he was not alone. The next sentence made Sarah's stomach turn. Daniel's father knew exactly what was happening. Sarah lowered the letter. Daniel's family had been involved. For decades. She continued reading. I kept copies of every document because I knew one day they would come for the farmhouse. Then came the part Sarah couldn't understand. I left the property to you because you are the only person in the family who never benefited from what was stolen. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Her father hadn't forgotten her. He had chosen her. There is one final document hidden beneath the farmhouse. It contains the original deed and the legal record proving that the land transfers were fraudulent. Sarah wiped her eyes. If they offer you money, refuse it. She remembered Daniel's $18,500 check. If they threaten you, do not leave. Her breathing became uneven. And if they tell you the farmhouse is worthless, remember this. They have spent 30 years trying to convince people of that because they are terrified someone will discover what lies beneath it. Sarah reached the final paragraph. You may think I left you a house. I didn't. I left you the truth. At the bottom of the page was one final sentence. And Sarah, when you finally find the deed, don't keep it hidden. Make them stand in public and explain what they did. Sarah folded the letter against her chest. For the first time since her husband had locked her outside, she didn't feel abandoned. Her father had known this day might come. He had prepared for it. Sarah stood and looked toward the wooden door at the end of the hidden room. The original deed was still somewhere beneath the farmhouse, and now she knew exactly what she had to find. 3 days later, Sarah walked into the county probate office carrying a brown folder. Inside were the documents her father had hidden for years. She also carried the original deed. She had found it behind a loose brick beneath the basement stairs, exactly where her father had indicated in the final letter. The document was dated 1974, and it changed everything. The farmhouse wasn't simply hers. It was the surviving legal parcel of the original Mercer estate. More importantly, the deed contained a clause stating that none of the surrounding land could be transferred without the approval of the original Mercer heirs. The transfers had violated that clause. Sarah's hands shook as she placed the deed on the attorney's desk. The attorney, Linda Brooks, read it twice. Then she looked up. Where did you get this? My father. Linda glanced at the date. This could reopen the entire estate. Sarah nodded. That's why they wanted me gone. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. Daniel arrived with Melissa. Richard Cole arrived with 2 attorneys. They looked confident, until Sarah entered the room. Daniel stared at her. You actually went through with this? Sarah sat across from him. "You told me I had no claim. I was trying to protect you." Sarah almost laughed. "From what?" Daniel said nothing. The judge reviewed the documents. Bank records were introduced, old property maps, payment ledgers, copies of transfers. Then came the original deed. Richard's attorney objected immediately. "This document's authenticity has not been established." Linda calmly placed another folder on the table. "We have the county archives matching record." The room became silent. The judge examined both documents. Then he turned toward Richard. "Mr. Cole, can you explain why these later transfers contradict the original deed?" Richard shifted in his chair. "That property was handled decades ago. That isn't an answer." His face reddened. Daniel looked at Sarah. She remembered his words from that winter night. It's worthless. Now he couldn't look at her. The financial records showed that Daniel's father had received payments connected to several of the disputed land transfers. Then another document was presented, a development agreement. The company planning to buy Sarah's land had already paid Daniel £75,000 as an advance. The sale could not proceed without Sarah's signature. Suddenly, the $18,500 offer made sense. Daniel hadn't been trying to help her. He had been trying to buy her silence. The judge ordered the transfers reviewed. The development agreement was suspended, and the court recognized Sarah's claim to the remaining estate assets. But the final valuation shocked everyone. The land, restored property rights, mineral interests, and investment accounts connected to the original estate were worth approximately $4.8 million. Sarah sat completely still. She didn't smile. She looked at Daniel, the man who had once stood behind a locked door while her children froze outside. He looked smaller now. Not powerful. Not frightening. Just exposed. Melissa lowered her eyes. Richard's attorneys began whispering urgently. Sarah looked down at the old photograph of her family. For years, someone had tried to erase her branch of it. They had failed. The farmhouse had never been worthless. It had simply been waiting for someone to prove it. Sarah did not leave the courthouse feeling rich. She left feeling tired. For months, she had fought simply to keep her children safe. The millions revealed in the hearing felt almost impossible to understand. So, she did not buy a mansion. She did not move to another state. She went back to the farmhouse. The first thing Sarah repaired was the roof, then the windows, then the heating system. Within 6 months, the abandoned property looked completely different. The broken porch was rebuilt. The kitchen floor was restored, including the section beneath which her father had hidden the first key. She kept the hidden room exactly as she had found it, but she turned it into a small family archive. The old photographs were cleaned and framed. Her father's documents were preserved, and the original deed was placed inside a secure display case. Sarah also used part of the inheritance to establish a small housing fund for single parents in the county. She knew what it felt like to have nowhere to go. She didn't want another mother standing outside in the snow with children in her arms. Daniel eventually lost his contracting business. The development deal collapsed. He was required to repay the money he had taken improperly, and the court ordered further investigation into the fraudulent property transfers. Sarah never celebrated his downfall. She simply stopped letting it control her life. Her daughter, Emily, grew attached to the farmhouse. She planted flowers beside the porch every spring. Her little brother, Noah, claimed the old barn as his fort, and slowly the property stopped feeling like the place where Sarah had been abandoned. It became home. One December evening, almost a year after that terrible night, Sarah stood in the kitchen preparing dinner. Snow was falling outside. The same kind of snow that had once terrified her. But this tide. The house was warm. Light spilled through every restored window. Her children were upstairs laughing. Sarah walked to the wall where the old family photograph hung. She had restored the damaged image. Her mother's face was visible again. The silver pendant around her neck caught the light. Sarah touched the frame. For years, she had believed her father had left her a broken farmhouse because he had nothing else to give. Now she understood. He had left her a place to return to, a truth worth fighting for, and a home that no one could take from her again. Sarah looked toward the window. Outside, the snow covered the same road she had walked that night with $63.42 in her pocket and 2 frightened children beside her. She remembered asking herself where they would sleep. Now she knew the answer. They were home. And beneath the old farmhouse floor, the secret that had nearly been buried forever had finally brought her family back together.